special thanks to you, Suzanne, for joining us from Rome. As Günther mentioned, we're almost on the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day. I know that you will be participating in a program in Rome where you now are. And it's my dear hope that many of those tuning in today, in whatever countries they are, will also find ways to reflect on the catastrophe that visited us all during the period of the Holocaust. Suzanne, you and I date back a long time. My gosh, what a pleasure it is to continue our friendship and our working relationship. For those of you who have not yet met Suzanne, she's connected in a very central way to the activities of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. At present, she's the director of the museum's Division of International Academic Programs. She did a Ph.D. in German history at the University of Maryland. She's devoted her research admirably to questions of religious faith, religious institutions, religious help, but also religious backsliding during the time of the Holocaust. Her first book, or her most recent book, was Nazi Persecution and Postwar Repercussions. The book that she's now researching involves Pope Pius XII, previously known as Eugenio Pacelli. He had lived for a number of years in Germany, was a Germanophile. For many years, the archives in the Vatican were not as open as scholars wish they would be. That's changed somewhat for the better in more recent years. And what takes Suzanne to Rome right now, in fact, is access to material for the study that will be forthcoming. Her presentation to us today will take us back to some of those earlier years and is bound to be both substantial and fascinating. Suzanne, it's my pleasure now to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Alvin, for the opportunity to be part of this webinar series. I'm going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to open it to questions and answers. And I'm really fortunate to know Alvin and Günther for many, many years, and I really admire the work that you both do. And I'm pleased today to talk about an extremely valuable new resource for scholars of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. On March 20th, 2020, as Alvin noted, the multiple archives relating to the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, covering the years from 1939 to 1958, opened. An estimated 16 million pages, these archives are accessible in multiple locations across Vatican City and Rome, and I am indeed here right now working on them. After a short delay due to the pandemic, scholars from around the world have been hard at work for nearly 3 years now. As part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Vatican Archives Initiative team, I've been part of the museum's efforts to survey these materials together with our colleagues at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Both of our institutions are working to secure study copies of select records for access in Washington and Jerusalem in the years to come. Now to dive in. Let me say at the outset that the views expressed in this lecture are mine alone and do not necessarily represent those of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or any other organization. Pope Pius XII's special relationship with Germany that Alvin mentioned is often mentioned as one factor in his decision-making during his tenure as nuncio or papal diplomat to Bavaria and Germany. He held these posts from 1917 to 29. During his tenure as Secretary of State of the Holy See, he held this position from 1930 to 39, and finally as Pope from 1939 to 1958. Now, in a speech in June 1945, Pope Pius XII rejected Germans' so-called collective guilt. He called National Socialism, the Nazi movement, a satanic ghost. He called for peace and brotherly understanding. Now, according to his closest advisor, Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, future Saint Pope Paul VI, who was Pope from 1963 to 78, it was, I quote, "the constant practice of the Holy See, inspired by reasons of Christian piety, to work regardless of any fault in favor of those who have been condemned to death." It is now possible to study the correspondence revealing the motives and private exchanges between these men and their papal representatives in Germany and the United States. These exchanges reveal, among other motives and beliefs, a view that Jews, bent on revenge after the Holocaust and animated by what the documents often refer to as a Mosaic law of an eye for an eye, Jews controlled the American military government and were responsible for unjust sentences in the Nuremberg trials. This is the belief that one finds in the documents. Pope Pius XII, Montini, and Monsignor Domenico Tardini, future Cardinal Secretary of State in the years 1958 to 63 under Saint Pope John XXIII, formed the most powerful ruling body within the Vatican since the death of Pope Pius XI in 1939. Now, from the Vatican, mostly behind the scenes, and sometimes very publicly, this triumvirate intervened for Germans indicted and convicted for war crimes by Allied courts and incarcerated in occupied Germany's Landsberg and Spandau prisons post-war. Now, in some cases, they intervened for war criminals extradited to and convicted by other nations, for example, Italy or Holland. Beyond the Secretariat of State, this is the office that performs the political and diplomatic functions of the Holy See or Vatican, to its diplomatic outposts, this triumvirate regularly turned to Amleto Giovanni Cardinal Cicognani, longtime power player, as apostolic delegate to the United States in the years 1933 to 59, and who later became the Cardinal Secretary of State from 1963 to 69 under Saint Pope Paul VI. They turned to American-born Cardinal Aloisius Muench. Muench was the most powerful American Catholic figure and influential Vatican representative in occupied Germany and subsequent West Germany between 1946 and 1959. And after being appointed Substitute Secretary of State in 1953, Angelo Cardinal Dell'Acqua also joined this powerful circle of internal and external discussions and debates over amnesty for German indicted and convicted war criminals. US military governor Lucius Clay, who was in his post from 1947 to 49, continued to build on the controversial post-war pattern of amnesties for Germans, praised by some and reviled by others. The Vatican had grave concerns. On October 29, 1948, Montini wrote to Muench, making clear the Secretariat's position. "Your Excellency," Montini wrote, "reports emanating from Washington indicate that the department which treats war criminals has been deluged with letters of protest, principally from Polish and Jewish elements," Montini wrote. Montini's note was very likely the reason why on December 14, 1948, Cicognani submitted the following petition to occupied authorities, and I quote here: "The Holy See presents a plea for mercy on behalf of German nationals condemned to death as war criminals by the military tribunals in Germany. Without any violation of justice, it is hoped that occupation authorities will commute the existing death sentences into other penalties, at least in those cases where there's even a slight doubt of guilt or where mitigating circumstances may be found." End of quote. Now, tensions in the German population were running high by the end of 1948. Father Hermann Reibel wrote to Muench on October 25th, 1948, on behalf of a man named Wilhelm Kaup, who'd been sentenced to death in the fall of 1947 due to his role as a guard in the former Dachau concentration camp. Kaup was accused of having shot a prisoner who was trying to escape. Neither Kaup nor Father Reibel denied this. Father Reibel, however, was concerned with the allegedly exaggerated and unfair accusations made by, and I quote, "a group of young Polish Jews." Kaup considered their testimony, and I quote, "to be fabricated and felt free of any guilt." In a pattern that we can see in a number of letters, Father Reibel believed that Kaup was a good Catholic and therefore could not have been guilty. Father Reibel considered, and I quote here, young Polish Jews to be quite capable of making unjust and untrue statements against former German guards just to satisfy their desire for revenge, writes Father Reibel. On January 20th, 1949, in a memorandum marked sensitive, Tardini wrote to Kronberg, Germany, Chargé d'Affaires Opilio Rossi. And I quote here, it's probably one of the most important documents I have found so far. Quote, "It has been brought to the attention of this office that numerous Israelites, who for the most part returned to Germany with the Allied troops, and who sometimes occupy important positions in the governments of occupation themselves, are engaged in activities that are often not without prejudice to Catholic interests," Tardini's letter says. I continue to quote Tardini's letter. "It is also stated there is in these regions a not inconsiderable resurgence of anti-Semitism. I, Tardini, would be most grateful to the pontifical representation if it would inform me about this matter, also indicating the names of those who occupy important posts," Tardini adds. So this letter is only one of regular discussions between the Pope, Tardini, and Montini on this issue within the inner sanctum of the Vatican Secretary of State. It was Muench and not Rossi who responded to the Secretariat in a multi-page report that I cannot quote here in for reasons of time. But to summarize it, Muench responded to the letter, assuring Tardini that, and here I quote, "not many Jews entered with the army of occupation, nor did they at any time hold important positions in the army, and," I continue to quote, "fortunately, a good number of officers of the highest rank are Catholics." However, adds Muench, in the American military government, and I quote, "while there are not many Jews in key positions, a large number held important positions on lower levels of administration, where policies of occupation are implemented." He added, and I continue to quote, "the majority of the personnel in the post-war trials of criminals, especially at Nuremberg, are persons of Jewish origin, and they did not come in a spirit of conciliation, but in a spirit of vindictiveness," end quote. Now, Muench's views here are not a surprise, and they are not new, and they're the subject of a book published in 2006. What is new here is the fact that Tardini, one of the three most powerful men in the Vatican, believed and asked about the presence of Jews in post-war Germany in imagined positions of strength and influence, asked even for their names. And this is not something Tardini would have done unless it had been discussed also with Montini, and the Pope himself. In January 1951, U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, who was in his post from 1949 to 52, issued the controversial Landsberg Report. Out of 28 prisoners condemned to death, 7 death sentences were confirmed. 7 weeks before issuing the January 31st clemency decision and report, McCloy found himself answering yet another plea, this time from Auxiliary Bishop of Munich, Johannes Neuhäusler. "My dear Bishop Dr. Neuhäusler," McCloy wrote, and I quote, "I wish to reply to your letter. I would like to point out these crimes for which these defendants were tried rank in some instances among the most atrocious known in history. These defendants were guilty of the torture and death of hundreds and in many cases thousands of helpless human beings." End of quote. I have many other examples that will be forthcoming in an essay in late 2023, and I'm sensitive to the need to leave the majority of our time for discussion, which is always the most interesting. But before we do that, I want to discuss some of the motives at play in the Vatican's clemency campaign. I can suggest several, though the research is still at fairly early stages. First, in 1945, Pope Pius XII stood poised to bring back many so-called stray sheep back to his flock. Father Ivo Zeiger, also a close confidant to the Pope, put it this way, and I quote him, "It will be of highest importance that the Holy Father will also bestow his fatherly love and help on the German people. Such an act of assistance, in spite of all the chance of hatred from the rest of the world, will for all time leave the deepest and most beneficial impression on the sorely afflicted people and will be one of the most effective means of encountering any hostility from the anti-clerical side," wrote Zeiger. Now, if one reads Zeiger's hopes in the light of the alarming reports to the Vatican nuncio or papal diplomat to Germany, Cesare Orsenigo, during and before the Third Reich from 1930 to 45, Orsenigo was receiving in the early 1930s from Catholics who hoped to find a way to be both good Catholics and good Nazis. One has to wonder if that same concern of losing Catholics and bringing Catholics back to the flock comes to the fore. The fear of losing Catholics to the Nazi movement unless a compromise was made did win the day in 1933, and now, post-war, it was time to bring back these lost sheep. Second, a leitmotif emerging from these files is that of gratitude on the part of the Vatican for those Germans who had helped spare the treasures of Vatican City during the war. In February 1948, Tardini wrote to Muench to intercede for Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker, former Reich ambassador to the Vatican during World War II, including during the German occupation of Rome. "Most Reverend Excellency," wrote Tardini, "I follow up regarding the trial of Baron von Weizsäcker. Your Reverend Excellency, if so requested, could specify Ambassador Weizsäcker took an interest in the practices carried out to obtain demilitarization of the city of Rome, and to have some centers recognized as hospital cities, such as Siena, Assisi, Chieti. Weizsäcker facilitated initiatives aimed at saving historical, bibliographical, and artistic relics, especially those of the Lazio region." The letter continues. Weizsäcker worked to have some capital punishments issued by the German military tribunals commuted, and so the religious institutes of Rome, the personnel of the papal dicasteries, and the members of the Palatine Guard could be issued protection documents by the German military authorities. Tardini concluded his letter this way. Now, Montini made similar arguments when he requested that Muench do what he could for German General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. In a letter dated December 3rd, 1949, Montini commented on receiving, and I quote, many calls for the Holy See to intervene on behalf of Marshal Kesselring. Montini was particularly passionate about the Kesselring case, writing, quote, in consideration of what was done during the war, also by the Marshal, for the salvation of the capital of Christianity, I beg your Reverend Excellency to work to mitigate the regime of imprisonment to which Kesselring is currently subjected, end quote. Muench went right to work as his superior had asked him to do. On December 23, 1949, he enlisted the help of Father Barnaba Sandman on a mission that is marked personal and confidential in the archival file. Quoting Muench here, I take the liberty of requesting your courteous collaboration for a practice of a delicate and difficult nature, entrusted to me by the Secretary of State of His Holiness, Muench writes. It concerns an intervention in favor of Marshal Kesselring. First of all, it seems to me necessary we obtain exact information on his legal situation and on the treatment he's receiving in the prisons. Then, to examine how to possibly obtain a mitigation of the treatment to which he seems to be subjected. Muench continues to write to Father Sandman, quote, and ultimately to study if and how we can request his release. Then Muench came to his ask of Father Sandman on behalf of Tardini. Would you, Reverend Father, be so kind as to endeavor, with due confidentiality, to obtain the necessary information about the Marshal and give me your opinion on what should be done for him, according to the above points. Your help and suggestions will be precious to me, he writes. So to conclude, so we can get to a discussion, let me quote one final letter received from an ordinary Catholic that can be found in these files. Those familiar with the Christian New Testament will recognize the players in the scene. I'm quoting from this letter. When Herod, in days gone by, was busily plotting to murder the child of Bethlehem, he concealed this plan behind a foreign mask and did his best to turn the unsuspecting 3 wise men into unwitting scouts. In the same way, his modern imitators today move heaven and earth to conceal their real purpose from the masses and make them unconscious tools of their intentions, wrote this anonymous person in a plea for Weizsäcker. So this was the atmosphere in those first post-war years in which the Vatican operated and made decisions. One may draw tentative conclusions, I must stress made with hesitancy, as many, many more years of work in these archives and evaluated against material from other archives will surely continue to broaden and change what we know today. Further, the impact of negative views about Jews was but one among many factors that entered into the centuries-old Vatican policy of neutrality and impartiality. Hard political realities meant making decisions barely discernible as decisions made as the Vicar of Christ on earth, as the Pope is. Declining influence undergirded what Juliana Chalmades calls a 20th century crusade to remake Christian Europe in those years. All the same, it is striking that Vatican neutrality and impartiality was abandoned in the case of German war criminals. Empathy, mercy, and repeatedly cited Christian charity for Germans after the Holocaust was a policy for Pope Pius XII, and his closest advisors gave directives to carry it out. Suspicion, fear, and centuries-old anti-Jewish tropes about Judaism as a religion that stood for an eye did not end after 1945. Based on these documents, there's reason to think these widespread sentiments were shared by the decision makers in the Vatican Secretary of State, and by extension, the Pope himself. And perhaps this should not surprise us. The sea change that would come with the Second Vatican Council, which took place from 1962 to 65 and defined anti-Semitism as a sin, was still decades away. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. This was very hard to digest, I think. It's good that you shared your first insights into your research. Thank you very much for sharing this with us. I think that we will have a lot to discuss here. And also thanks for sharing your views on what were possible reasons that they acted in this way. So we open this up now for discussion, and please join us for the discussion. You can do that either by joining the panel directly. So then you please hit a little button there, raise hand, and I will invite you to join us on the panel. You can also use the chat function. So I will give me just a second to promote people to the panel. And then we can start right away. So Carrie Hillebrand, if you can, please make yourself visible and unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. What did the archives reveal about the so-called rat line that was established by the Vatican to facilitate the escape of Nazi war criminals to South America, primarily Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay?
Yeah, it's an important question, and one that that scholars that are working on the new archives these last 3 years are very eager to look at. I am not an expert on the so-called rat line myself. I would absolutely recommend reading Gerald Steinacher's excellent book. He's a professor at University of Nebraska, and we've bumped into each other at the archives, and he is continuing his work on this question. I have seen some materials on it, and this is where the Q&A is great, because we can really be very, we can parse things out carefully. The escape of German and Axis war criminals out beyond Europe and Rome to Latin America and other countries was something, I think it's worth talking a little about the process. Post-war Europe was teeming with refugees or displaced persons, stateless persons without identity documents. The role that some church officials played was, for example, probably the most famous example is Alois Hudal in the Maria del Anima, the Austrian Pontifical Institute in Rome. A stateless person or a displaced person would approach one of these pontifical colleges, would approach Hudal, for example, and ask for an identity paper from the Vatican. They would give a false name. Now, sometimes Hudal knew full well who he was dealing with, that it was not, that really he was dealing with a war criminal, would issue a false identity card. With this identity card, it meant that that person could then go to the International Red Cross and receive an exit permit. And in this way, the Vatican documentation and the International Red Cross documentation helped war criminals like Otto von Wester, for example, the governor of, and Hans Frank, governor, to try and escape. Now, what we don't know, what scholars are asking, because we've known about this so-called rat line for many years, and Philip Sands in his recent book has found some information that the American CIA was also working potentially with the Vatican here. And that's definitely something to be pursued in the new archives. And I know Professor Steinacher is looking into that. What we don't know is how much did, for example, Montini, one of the people I was talking about, the future Saint Pope Paul VI, and essentially #2 in the Vatican immediately after the war. What did he know? Montini was the head of the Pontifical Assistance Commissions, or PCAs, that helped refugees. And the claims made until these archives were opened was that the PCAs, Pontifical Assistance Commissions, helped millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people. How could they know when some war criminals slipped through? And they're sort of saying what Alois Hudal was doing, we didn't know about at the level of the Secretariat of State. We don't have a good, clear document trail yet, but scholars are searching. So I'm trying to be as kind of specific as I can be.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's easy to understand why the Vatican's kept these archives sealed for so many decades. They're really damning.
Well, it's a question I've given a lot of thought to as a practicing Catholic myself, and I'm just finishing the documentary about the United States and the Holocaust, and I think it's I'm less and less surprised as I'm working through these documents now for 3 years. I'm less and less surprised because I often have to remind myself that before 1965 and the Second Vatican Council, what we today consider anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish prejudice, was actually, that was church teaching, legitimate church teaching until the mid-1960s. And so in fact, it was unusual for Catholic figures all the way from the pews to the ruling authorities not to have views that we today would consider anti-Semitism. So I try to keep that in mind as I'm going through these papers. I think too that when Pope Francis opened these archives, when he made a very kind of, now it's a little bit famous with scholars, in March 2019, Pope Francis said, the church is not afraid of history. And we in the scholarly community interpreted that as there's a call for transparency here. And, you know, I think the message that we read as scholars was, let's see what the documents say, let's put what they say out there, and there shouldn't be a reason to hide from the past. It's better to reckon with the past. Anyway, I'll try not to talk so much.
No, that's why we invited you. We want you to explain to us what you found in these articles. Thank you. Rachel Halpern, before we get to your question, and then Professor John Pawlikowski.
Oh, Father John is here. Oh, yes. Wonderful.
Just one reminder that, yes, we do record, there was a question in the chat, we do record this webinar, and we hope that we can make it available then after a week or so. There were some questions also on your view on why did the Vatican believe the Nuremberg judges were influenced by Jews, and maybe we can take this together with the question on what do you attribute the radical change in the Vatican policy towards Jews between the period you were talking about and then Vatican II?
Yeah. Gosh, I could say I could, for those two questions, talk the rest of the time. So let me just try not to be too big. I'll take the second one first. I always love to use opportunities like this to say the church is not a monolithic organization. I'm sure Father John would agree. Even at the level of the Secretariat of State, where it's the Pope and his in the late 40s, his two substitute secretaries, Tardini and Montini, they did not always agree with one another, nor did their nuncios or papal diplomats always agree with the Secretariat of State. And you can just take that and bring it out to the Catholic hierarchy and to ordinary Catholics. So there were those Catholics, even during the Holocaust, before the Holocaust, who somehow, despite church teaching, were able to think about Jews and Judaism in a different way. Let me give an example from not the Vatican Apostolic Archive, where the work that I just presented came from, but a different Vatican archive, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which most most of us remember as the Inquisition, formerly Inquisition archive. There's a case of a French Capuchin priest named Father Marie Benoit, who's recognized as a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem for his rescue work on behalf of both the baptized and non-baptized in France and in Italy. So Father Marie Benoit, from around 41 onwards, was active in southern France and then in Rome when the Germans occupied Rome to help, at first, Catholics who were persecuted as Jews because under Nazi and Axis racial laws, they might have a Jewish grandparent and were considered Jewish, even though they're baptized Catholics. But then Father Benoit started to help Jews who had no pretense of trying to be baptized. They just needed help. He helped both. And I think that work started to really change him. And in 1944, about 6 months after the Germans left Rome, Father Benoit started a small lecture series, which today we would think of, I think, as kind of Catholic Jewish dialogue. He started a small dialogue group at the Sisters of Sion headquarters in Rome. And he put a small ad in a semi-official church newspaper noting the date and time. And his superior, the head of the Holy Office, his superior actually was the head of the Capuchin order, but another superior, the head of the Holy Office of all teaching of faith and morals to all Catholics, saw the notice and said, "What is this? Why is a Catholic priest holding this Christian Jewish kind of meeting? That's against our teaching based on our 1928 Code of Canon Law." So this case is canon lawyers going back and forth with the head of the Capuchin order, with the Secretariat of State, with the Holy Office, where it's just fascinating because Benoit said, "I met with the Pope in 1943. He knew I was rescuing Jews and non-Jews, and he knew about my work and he didn't stop my work. And now you're telling me I can't hold these meetings. It doesn't make sense." And there's a whole discussion. But what the point of all that is, Father Benoit was able, even at that time, to say, I will actively help Jews. And many Jews were hidden on Vatican grounds, as well as across Italy and in France as well, saved by Catholics in hiding. So these are the seeds, I think, of what becomes Vatican II. There are those Catholics who say, we don't agree with considering Jews as separate from ourselves. We don't agree with what some Catholics speak is called indifferentism, where you shouldn't treat other religions as equal to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the true religion, and if you parlay with other religions, that's indifferentism. That was an old belief that's no longer in existence. So I think those kinds of Catholics, like Father Marie Benoit and other examples we're finding in the archives, they gathered steam and they found powerful allies to the point where something like Vatican II could pass. The question before that, why did the top officials in the Vatican Secretary of State believe that Jews had influence on American occupation authorities? I too struggle with this, considering that after 1945, 6 million Jews are murdered. It's really, just from a practical point of view, not logical to think that they could be controlling the American justice system and the Nuremberg tribunals. In the longer answer that Aloisius Muench gave, he explains what is true, that emigres who did manage to escape Europe, those lucky enough to come to the United States and be let in, did return to Germany as part of the American Army and the American Occupation Authority at very lower level positions as interpreters generally, because they spoke German. They certainly weren't holding influential positions. And some of the officers in the Nuremberg American personnel were of Jewish origin, but by no means the majority, and by no means the lead judges. I chalk this up to, we have to remember there were 2,000 years of anti-Jewish teaching in the Catholic Church that was only rejected not even 100 years ago. That's a lot of powerful mythology to let go of. So if you're a top officer in the Vatican, you've been steeped in this tradition for your entire life. It's what you believe. It's what you've. So it is kind of astonishing, though, that the imagined power of Jews 3 years after the Holocaust can still have such a hold on authority figures like the Pope and his officers.
In the German population, by the way, it was not much different, but that is also not surprising. But yeah, Rachel Halpin, please go ahead with your question. Thanks for joining us. You're muted still.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. My question is this: this campaign of mercy and understanding towards Nazi war criminals, which to a large extent was conducted, as you said, in confidential manner, whether that also somehow translated into some kind of guidance and instructions given to Catholic clergy in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Poland, to also present the crimes against Jews in a kind of tilted way that was meant to evoke the sense of mercy and understanding and acceptance of the entire criminal undertaking against Jews, and that was then preached from the pulpits of churches and towns, villages, etc.
Yeah. The power of anti-Jewish tropes in Catholic thinking during the war, before the war, and after the war is so palpable in so much of the archival material. This is not totally new. In research I did about 20 years ago, these public statements about love and mercy and New Testament forgiveness, I wondered, with access to public statements, whether there was anti-Jewish sentiment underneath that, especially with these explicit references to Mosaic law and revenge. The word revenge is constantly coming up. And now with the Vatican archives being open, we know the answer is yes. And we also know the answer is this idea that Jews are a powerful group still after the Holocaust that are going to come and infiltrate Europe again and will hold too much power and influence. It was still extremely strong after the war. Yeah, I don't know too much more to what else to say. I did see a question from Agilolf Kesselring, and I've been fascinated to read about the Kesselring case. So I hope he can ask his question too.
Absolutely, yes. Let's take Father John first, and then we get to his question, if that's okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
You're still muted. Can you unmute yourself? Still on mute. Oh.
Uh-oh.
Yes, maybe now?
Yeah, you have me now.
Yes, very good.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, my observation, more in a way of observations to maybe add to what Suzanne presented to us today. But in terms of motivation, I would add the following. I think there's considerable documentary evidence that there was not a high level of trust on the part of the Vatican of the United States in the period of the war. And there was a feeling that Roosevelt was unduly controlled by Protestants, and that in a sense, there was a concrete effort to undermine the Catholic community during this period and so on. So that, I think, has to be taken into some consideration. I think that we also have to consider the Vatican's attitude in the immediate post-war period towards the fact that they now had, for after many years, political leadership power in the post-German government. That Adenauer and so on, they had to do everything to protect Adenauer from any kind of stain or the German. Now, what we have, for example, is a concrete instance where Gordon Zahn, who wrote the first volume challenging the actions of the German Catholic during the war, the Vatican sent Cardinal Bea, well, he wasn't cardinal then, but Bea to Chicago to meet with the president of Loyola University in order to try to convince him to fire Zahn over what he had written. I was a student there, an undergraduate student during all that, and so I know it from kind of that level. The president, however, the Jesuit president of Loyola, refused to fire Zahn. But you can see again the mindset. If you read the document on the Shoah, the document in the 1998 Vatican Statement on the Holocaust, I mean, there were basically 4 key elements, all controversial, that were forced upon the text by Cardinal Ratzinger from CDF. And he told Cardinal Cassidy, who had written the document, either you include these or the document cannot be published. Cassidy made the difficult decision of saying, well, it's better we have the document despite the major flaws. And one of the flaws was this whole thing that it was only deviant Catholics who were misled, who really participated in anti-Semitic efforts against the Jews. So you see, I think this broad mindset. Just one final comment about the rat line. I think sometimes I see, particularly from non-Catholics, some lack of understanding about the relationship between, say, the various pontifical colleges in Rome and the Vatican itself. The Croatian College was certainly a center of the rat line. That doesn't mean the Vatican knew everything that was going on just because it's pontifical. But I think you're perfectly correct. The documentary evidence still needs to be pursued on this. Several years ago, if I recall correctly, there were some materials found in Argentine governmental archives in Rome that would indicate that there was some knowledge in important Vatican circles of what was happening at the Croatian College. But you're perfectly correct, I think, in saying that this is still there's still a lot of nebulousness regarding how this process really worked and how much the upper echelons of the Vatican were really involved. So those are just, I don't know if you have anything to respond, but those were Just
No, I do. One of the projects that the Holocaust Museum is doing as part of the Vatican Archives initiative, we concluded agreement with the German college last, I think it was last April we signed, and we've digitized the Alois Hudal papers, the Austrian bishop who was very infamous for his role in the so-called rat line. These are now digitized, which means they will be PDF searchable for the first time. And I think that that will be very helpful for scholars who, let's say we find certain code names that we can now be searched for across the entire set of the Hudal papers and start to really piece this together. There is absolute clear evidence in the Hudal papers that he helped in the rat line. Charlotte von Vester, Otto von Wester's wife, wrote him saying, "Thank you for what you did for my husband" in the late 40s. So we're looking forward to scholars being able to take that next step digitally with this material. And I think the material is there in the newly released Vatican papers. The pontifical colleges are outside of the Vatican archives. I think it's there. It's just we still have to figure out what are the keywords and places and folders to look, because it's 16 million pages of stuff. But definitely scholars are on the hunt for that for sure. So thank you, Father John.
Thank you. Would you like to talk about the comment by Eduard Geist, please? So do you want me to read it out to you, or do you want?
Yes, please. That would be
Yes.
great.
So thank you very much for your insights. You mentioned Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. His clemency campaign has been researched from a German viewpoint, including the Catholic Church side by Kerstin von Lingen. The environment is the Cold War and West German rearmament. What was on the US and UK agenda since 1947-48? Can this fear from communism and the realpolitik view be found as a reason in the Vatican archives?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I'm glad for the opportunity to mention the Cold War and the fear and hatred of communism on the part of the Catholic Church. And in post-war Italy, communism is perceived as a real threat in Italy itself. So this is all really crucial to the background. And I think what one sees in the documents, and it does play into efforts on behalf of, by the Vatican, on behalf of Hans Frank, Oswald Pohl, von Weizsäcker, Kesselring, it's other Nuremberg defendants, is, well, communism is the biggest enemy, the mightiest enemy. And this is the viewpoint of the American government as well, who starts to recruit some of these former Nazis and or also be part of the escape to Latin America route so they can have these anti-communist allies. This is an aspect that I want to research more about, exactly what weighed how much in these different calculations that are being made when both the American government and the Vatican decide to jump in with former Nazis for the sake of fighting communism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There was a question about pertinent recommendations for books, articles on this subject. So what I will do now, I put in the chat the link to your page on the Holocaust Memorial Museum, so that I think that has a list of that, but maybe you want to mention something in addition to that.
Gosh, well, even though the archives have been open for almost 3 years, in the life of a historian, that's very short. And in the life of 16 million pages to go through, it's really short. So in terms of new books that really are based on the Vatican archival material, they're only now starting to come out in the last 6 to 12 months. So I have to think about where to direct you there. It's still pretty early, and I also don't want to. I don't want to
be on the
prejudice.
lookout for your book, that's for sure.
Oh, that'll take some time.
Good. Yeah. So there's one more comment here in the chat. Maybe you want to react to this. So again, thank you. Very insightful talk, Dr. Brown-Fleming. If only the Vatican had shown such love and mercy towards the Jewish people. What I find disturbing is that these Vatican officials were not even trying to hide the support of Nazi war criminals and the enduring anti-Semitism. Is that true? Were they not trying to hide it? Because some of it was classified. What do you think?
I guess it's such a natural, good question, and I think when one reads lots of these documents, you see that there's just this entire worldview. It's not only in the Vatican, it's among the in the United States, in the American military government, in the German population. There's still such a prevailing negative view of Jews and Judaism that sort of probably should be almost assumed unless explicitly stated otherwise. Now, I did come across just this week a funny, not funny, but a kind of a counter case, if you will, or one could look at it that way. In 1953, I don't know how many of you would know about, I did not, the execution of the Rosenbergs in the United States for spying for the Soviets. And the US government, actually a judge indicted the Rosenbergs for espionage, and they were executed in the United States in 1953. And there was a huge campaign to stay their execution. Lots of letters came flooding to the Pope, to Pope Pius XII. And they're a Jewish couple. So they're a Jewish American couple accused of espionage and executed for it by the US government. And one can just see that same thinking that it starts in it's before 1933, but I've seen it through the entire Third Reich and in the post-war period, where letters are flying into the Secretary of State saying, how could you possibly intervene for these two communists? How dare you, on one side, and then left-leaning or communist writing in to say, look, you're not, you say that you're a church of love and mercy. Why don't you speak out on behalf of the Rosenbergs? So he's kind of getting it from two sides. In the case of the Rosenberg couple in 1953, they're a Jewish couple. So I thought, this put up against these Nazi war criminals is interesting. And I was literally reading that 600-page folder today. So this is my only from thinking about it today analysis. Communism's on the rise in Italy. An Italian communist newspaper writes a critical article of the Pope saying he's not intervening for the Rosenbergs. The Pope responds by publicly letting it be known in the church semi-official publication that he'd been receiving petitions and he passed them on to the US president. Then the American newspapers get hold of this and report it as Pope pleads clemency for this Jewish couple. And then the American Catholics start writing, how dare you, Pope Pius XII, our sons are dying in Korea, and how could you intervene, stay out of our business anyway. and what the Pope actually did was pretty typical of what he had done the entire World War II period, which was to not take any position at all. What he'd actually done was instruct his US diplomat or nuncio Cicognani to verbally say to the White House, we've been receiving pleas, we pass them to you without any comment on their merit. We're not going to take a position. And then in writing follows up to say, we're letting you know we've gotten lots of pleas, but we're not commenting on their merit. So just neutrality, neutrality, neutrality. And one thing that I also feel is good to bring in here that we haven't really covered yet was this also was true for Catholics. David Kurtzer's new book that I'm sure some in this audience have read, I found astonishing on a number of levels. Also astonishing was how much the France and Norway and Denmark and Poland were also begging the Pope and the Secretariat of State to say something on behalf of Catholics in 1939, 1940, and he would not budge from neutrality and impartiality on behalf of Catholics either. So it's very complicated. It's a really hard thing to wrap your head around.
Thank you so much. I think this is fascinating. Your research is really fascinating, and that you look at this archival material, and we hope that more research is going to look at that. But I found also what you said very convincing about we have to see that in a context where anti-Semitism is a kind of the norm even.
Yes, yes.
And that can explain a lot of the underlying, or some of the letters even, and this is just the framing of that in some parts.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking our speaker, Dr. Brown-Fleming, for this great talk, for sharing her insights, what she found so far in the archives, and also the views. And also thank you for this wonderful panel that we could have this conversation here. Please keep us updated with your work. And I hand over now to Alvin Rosenfeld to close this webinar. Thank you so much.
I'll add my thanks, Suzanne, to Günter's and everyone else's. Really, you took us into very, very important material. We realize you're still at the beginning of your research. We wish you the strength and the patience to just continue, because you're on to important material. At one point, you mentioned that some of the ideas you're dealing with go back 2,000 years and have been with us all along. And once something that toxic gets embedded within a culture, it's very, very hard to root it out of the culture. And yet, from time to time, there are good people who transcend that. And you've written about some of those as well. So we look forward to staying in touch. We'll look forward to reading you and hearing you again. For now, let it all go well for you in Rome, and we'll next see you, I hope, in Washington.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.